Well, let's make a start, Bethany. So if you missed it, my name's Annette, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, Getting Back to Business, Navigating Workplace Challenges in a COVID World. Today's webinar is powered by HR Assured. We help businesses navigate around Australia and New Zealand's complex employment laws by providing a range of services and products to ensure businesses are compliant. So welcome to our clients and anyone who is not. We're going to be presenting shortly, but before we get into the depths of the webinar, I just wanted to let you know a little bit about HR Assured and what we do. So if you're not familiar with us, we are the outsourced service that helps you build a smarter business. HR Assured clients have access to our award-winning services, including our 24/7 telephone advisory service, comprehensive HR audit, WHS audit, HR software, WHS management software, insurance and representation, and a library of legal resources. So today's webinar will be hosted by Bethany Silverman. Bethany is a solicitor at FCB and HR Assured, and she regularly provides advice to a wide range of businesses in respect of compliance with workplace laws and managing complex matters. So over to you, Bethany. Welcome and thank you for presenting today.
Thanks, Annette, and thank you everyone for taking the time out of your day to attend our webinar. So today we'll be focusing on canvassing the state-based public health orders and how they impact particular industries and businesses. Now, I won't go into extensive detail regarding every single public health order because unfortunately we don't have all day. There are quite a few of them now and they are changing really rapidly. So I'm just planning on giving sort of a broad brush overview of the different public health orders in each state. I'll then take you through identifying and mitigating health and safety risks in the workplace as many businesses are starting to reopen and return to work. We'll also go through implementing a vaccination policy and some considerations in that respect. And I'll then touch on some people management issues with respect to returning to the workplace and the office. So this includes managing remote and hybrid workforces, other people management issues to consider like people refusing to be vaccinated, people refusing to come back to the office and things like that, and also how to undertake disciplinary processes in this regard. We'll also have some time at the end for questions, so please pop them in the chat or the Q&A and I'll have a look once I've finished the webinar. So moving into the state-based public health orders. So starting with New South Wales, many of us are probably aware that New South Wales started reopening a couple of weeks ago. Vaccination rules have applied for staff and customers aged 16 years and over. In certain premises and certain businesses. So these include entertainment facilities, recreation facilities, hospitality venues, hairdressers, and retail premises. They also apply to places of public worship, places where weddings, funerals, or memorial services are being held, public swimming pools, information and education facilities like museums, art galleries, or visitor information centres, betting agencies and gaming lounges, and markets that do not predominantly sell food. Now, of course, the public health order does outline all of those ones. That is just a bit of a summary of them. So the vaccination requirements under this public health order is that for those living in Greater Sydney, including the Blue Mountains, Central Coast, Shell Harbour and Wollongong local government areas, from the 11th of October, you must be fully vaccinated to work at those mentioned businesses. And in regional and rural New South Wales, there's a bit of a grace period. So from the 11th of October, the person must have had one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine and then be fully vaccinated by the 1st of November. So obviously that's coming up in just a few days now. Sorry, my slides just keep skipping. There is also a carve out for workers who are aged under 16 and who are not fully vaccinated. They may continue to work after the 11th of October. Also in New South Wales, there are mandatory vaccination requirements for residential aged care workers, including contract staff, health practitioners and students on placement. So these workers must be fully vaccinated by the 25th of October to continue attending work. And this has been extended to apply to in-home and community aged care workers as well. There is also a public health order for healthcare workers. They're required to be partially vaccinated by the 30th of September and fully vaccinated by the 30th of November. However, it is important to note that the definition of a healthcare facility to which these particular directions apply is actually very narrow and doesn't extend to your standard GP practice or dental surgery or those types of medical facilities. There are also requirements for disability workers to have received a first dose by the 25th of October and be fully vaccinated by the 29th of November. And education workers must also be fully vaccinated by the 8th of November in order to continue to attend work. So I won't go through all of the other vaccination and evidence requirements under these public health orders, but these directions do require that evidence is provided that the person is vaccinated in accordance with the requirements. Moving on to Victoria. Now, Victoria is obviously still in some level of restriction at the moment, and today is the reopening of a lot of different venues and premises, including retail premises. We have a number of different public health orders. So these include the broad workers directions, which mandates vaccinations for all authorised workers in Victoria in order to physically attend the workplace. So these workers must have received a first dose of a COVID-19 vaccine by the 22nd of October and be fully vaccinated by the 26th of November. So these directions outline what workers these requirements apply to. It includes people working in accommodation, airport workers, community service workers, emergency services, entertainment workers, funeral workers, manufacturing, marriage celebrants, meat and seafood processing, mining, physical recreation, professional services, public sector employees, real estate employees, religious workers, repair and maintenance workers, retail workers, including distribution centre workers, social and community workers, transport workers, and veterinary and pet and animal care workers. So it's a pretty extensive list, and there is a definition of all of these workers in the orders as well. We also have the recently released open premises directions, which provides that operators of the certain premises specified in the directions must take all reasonable steps to ensure that a patron aged 16 years or older who is not fully vaccinated and does not have a medical exemption or cannot provide acceptable evidence of either does not enter or remain on the premises. Workers must be fully vaccinated or hold a valid medical exemption to work at an open premises. These directions also require things like density limits and COVID-19 marshal requirements. Interestingly, last night, the Victorian government actually tightened the exemption criteria. So if somebody has a general sort of medical certificate, it will no longer be acceptable. There is a bit of a grace period up until, I believe, the 11th of November, but essentially to have a valid medical exemption up until that point or after that point, the person will need to go back to their doctor and fill in the Australian Immunisation Register exemption form in order to have a valid exemption. And this is really to try and avoid people essentially doctor shopping to get an exemption. In Victoria, some of the other directions that we have are the specified facilities directions. So these apply to residential aged care workers who must have had a first dose of a COVID-19 vaccine by the 1st of October and a second dose by the 15th of November. Construction workers performing work at a construction site, including an employee of the operator and any contractor engaged by the operator or by a third party, must have received their first dose by the 2nd of October and second dose by the 13th of November. Healthcare workers who work at healthcare facilities are required to have received their first dose by the 29th of October, so today, and receive their second dose by the 15th of December. And also education workers who provide childcare or early childhood services or work at an education facility are also required to have received a first dose by the 25th of October and a second dose by the 29th of November. Also in Victoria, we have the workplaces directions, which govern how workplaces such as offices can operate. I won't go into too much detail in respect of that, other than to say that there is a requirement still that if somebody can work from home, they must, and that is in place up until the 18th of November. So that applies, for your standard office building where people can work from home and they don't really need to go into the office. So moving on to Queensland. So in Queensland, residential aged care workers are required to be vaccinated against COVID-19 in order to enter, engage in work or duties or provide services at a residential aged care facility. So the first dose must have been received by the 16th of September, and they must have received all prescribed doses, so be fully vaccinated by the 31st of October, or provide evidence of a booking to receive that dose by that date. Ongoing business restrictions, including COVID safe plans and density limits information collection, also apply. There are also some vaccination requirements which apply to hospitals and in particular those entering COVID wards. In South Australia, there are a couple of different public health orders in place. So again, for residential aged care facilities, from the 17th of September, all staff must have received at least one dose of a approved COVID-19 vaccination and have evidence of a booking to receive or have received a second dose. Healthcare workers are also required under the Emergency Management Healthcare Setting Workers Vaccination Directions. These directions provide that a worker must not engage in work or perform duties in a healthcare setting from the 1st of November unless the person has received at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. And also commercial transport and freight workers. So from the 7th of October, all commercial transport and freight workers entering South Australia by road from the ACT, New South Wales and Victoria must be able to produce evidence of having received at least one dose of an approved COVID-19 vaccine. I was reading up a couple of days ago on some unfair dismissal cases with respect to freight workers and came across one where an employee did attempt to enter South Australia by road, but they were not vaccinated. And essentially there was a bit of a tantrum thrown by the employee, which resulted in their termination. So it's a really interesting space at the moment with respect to employment law. In Tasmania, there are also a couple of public health orders. So obviously we're seeing a bit of a trend here with residential aged care workers. So under these, the mandatory vaccination of certain workers directions, workers or volunteers at a residential aged care facility need to have had a first dose of the COVID-19 vaccine or have a booking for it by the 17th of September. Healthcare workers are also required under the same directions to be vaccinated. And quarantine workers are also required to be vaccinated from the 17th of September. This also applies to anybody providing quarantine transport services. So the Tasmanian directions use some interesting terminology. So they use the words sufficiently vaccinated, and then each different direction will define what is sufficiently vaccinated. So it may be that by a certain date, sufficiently vaccinated means that the person is partially vaccinated, and by another date, it might mean that they have to be fully vaccinated. In the Northern Territory, so these are relatively new directions which have been released, and they're a little bit more sort of broadly applying and open to interpretation than other states. So workers captured by these directions will be required to have received the first dose of an available COVID-19 vaccine to attend their workplace on and from the 13th of November and have had their second dose by the 24th of December. This obviously doesn't apply to workers who have an evidence contraindication to all COVID-19 vaccines. So the workers that are required to have received the COVID-19 vaccine to attend their workplace include workers who, during the course of their work, are likely to come into direct contact with vulnerable people, including Aboriginal people and those who can't be vaccinated due to a medical condition or their age. Work in high-risk settings or who are likely to, during the course of their work, come into contact with a person or thing that poses a risk of COVID-19 infection, or perform work that is necessary for the operation or maintenance of essential infrastructure or essential logistics in the Northern Territory. So the directions do go into specific examples of who is captured under each category. So for example, somebody working in a high risk setting would be somebody working in a residential aged care facility or a hospital, or who otherwise works in an area where people who are symptomatic may go, like a medical facility. People who during the course of their work who are likely to come into direct contact with vulnerable people would also include people working in aged care facilities, but would also apply to people who work in Indigenous communities as well. In Western Australia, so they've taken a very broad approach as well and announced on the 20th of October that a mandatory COVID-19 vaccination policy for most occupations and workforces would be introduced under a phased approach. So this policy follows existing mandates in place for workers in high-risk industries, including those interacting with people at an increased risk of being infected with COVID or vulnerable people. So under this phased approach, there are three main groups. Group one are industries that are determined to have high transmission risk or vulnerability risk or are necessary or critical to avoid catastrophic risk to the safety of the community. So this includes like healthcare workers and then primary health workers. Group two includes industries and workforces that are deemed critical to the ongoing delivery of business and the function of the community. And group three are those who must be fully vaccinated to attend work during a lockdown or similar restrictions. In the event of a lockdown, these workers will not be permitted to leave their home to attend work unless they are fully vaccinated. So some of the industries, particularly in group one, may already have public health orders in place, including those in primary healthcare settings, exposed port workers, and residential aged care workers. We have been checking regularly, but at present it doesn't appear that there are any other published public health orders which affect the other groups, but we expect that these will follow. This is really important in that in the absence of a public health order, you don't actually have anything to rely on to enforce vaccination within your workforce. So you can't rely on a simple statement from the government. There has to be something in writing and legislated for you to enforce it. And finally, the ACT. So since the 17th of September, a public health emergency direction has prohibited a worker from entering or remaining on the premises of a residential aged care facility or undertaking a particular function, unless that person has received at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. Under the same direction, healthcare workers are required to have received their first dose of a COVID-19 vaccine by today and be fully vaccinated by the 1st of December. And we also have some other applications for workers in certain healthcare settings to be fully vaccinated or have an approved exemption to be permitted to attend work. And finally, in the education setting, workers in the ACT cannot work at a school or early education and care facility if from the 1st of November they're not partially vaccinated, and from the 29th of November they're not fully vaccinated. So what to do if a public health order applies to your business? So if a public health order does apply to your business and your employees or some of your employees are required to be vaccinated, we recommend taking the following steps. So you should read through the directions and familiarise yourself with the requirements and definitions. This will help you identify if all of your employees are covered or just some. So in some states, for example, with healthcare facilities, there is a carve out that in an area of the facility where the person is, or that is not, being used as a healthcare facility, the person does not have to be vaccinated. So if you have, an office setting out the back where admin staff or account staff work and they don't come into contact with patients on a regular basis, then they may not need to be vaccinated under those orders. Once you have familiarised yourself with the directions and who is required to be vaccinated, you should notify employees of the requirements contained in the directions regarding vaccination requirements and evidence requirements, if any. Some of the public health orders, and in particular Victoria, actually require that you notify employees in writing. You should engage with employees to encourage compliance with the vaccination requirements, and request employees provide vaccination evidence as promptly as possible to avoid disruptions in their ability to perform work. and in particular, if that is required by the directions. If an employee is unvaccinated or they haven't provided the required vaccination evidence by the required dates, they will need to be placed on a period of unpaid leave or by agreement paid leave. However, generally they won't be able to access personal leave in those circumstances. And finally, in the event that an employee refuses to comply with the directions, we recommend seeking advice concerning the options available, which may include ending the employment relationship. And this is really because placing someone on a period of unpaid leave is really not a long-term solution. Many businesses that have been closed for a really long time don't have the capacity to have some of their workforce just not at work. So it's really important to ensure that you are engaging with your employees and encouraging them to be vaccinated in accordance with the requirements under any public health order. And if they don't, then it may be that their employment relationship is sufficiently frustrated that it cannot continue. So moving on to health and safety risks in the workplace. So this is really important as we start to return to the workplace and return to settings where people might be engaged with customers or clients as well. So there is a requirement under the Work Health and Safety Act that a person conducting a business or undertaking, or a PBCU, must ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety at work of workers engaged or caused to be engaged by the business or undertaking. So this includes those who are employed directly or engaged directly, or workers whose activities in carrying out the work are influenced or directed by the person whilst such workers are at work in the business or undertaking. So this might include contractors coming in or third-party providers as well. So in order to minimise the risks of COVID-19 in the workplace, we need to consider the recommendations of peak bodies like Safe Work Australia. So obviously you will need to undertake a risk assessment to determine what control measures should be in place in order to discharge your obligations. So some factors that they recommend are undertaking that risk assessment, and note that in some jurisdictions, workplaces are required to develop COVID-19 safety plans under public health orders anyway. Consider the effectiveness of available control measures and how they will help manage the risks of COVID-19, including any available vaccines. Consulting with workers and health and safety representatives, if your business has them, about COVID-19 and relevant control measures, including the COVID-19 vaccines. Consult, cooperate and coordinate as far as is reasonably practicable with any other duty holders. So this might be if you are renting out an office space, you may need to engage with the operator of that building as well to understand what steps are being taken in, for example, common areas like lifts and lobbies, and determining what control measures are reasonably practicable for you to implement in the workplace. Some other examples are considering the extent of community transmission of COVID where the relevant workplace is located or where the workers perform their work. So this is obviously a very state-based consideration at the moment. Victoria is still experiencing very high case numbers as opposed to South Australia or Queensland that have very little case numbers, if any, at the moment. In consideration of the location, how likely is it that workers will be exposed to COVID-19? So this is also a consideration in that, well, are my workers engaging with clients or with customers? Will they need to catch public transport or can they drive to work? Things like that are really important. Considering whether vaccinations are available for your workers, considering the recommendations of the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee or the AHPPC. Based on the available evidence, is the vaccine likely to reduce transmission or improve health outcomes for those in the workplace? Are vaccines effective at reducing the serious health effects of COVID-19, taking into account the particular variant that's circulating at the moment? So obviously we know that the Delta variant is highly contagious. However, the statistics are showing that whilst a COVID-19 vaccine will not completely eradicate the likelihood of getting COVID, people who do contract COVID after being vaccinated are less likely to run it severely as opposed to those who are non-vaccinated. Some further considerations, and I know this is a very long list, our work is likely to be exposed to COVID-19 as part of their work. So if we're considering hotel quarantine workers or people working in a COVID ward or a medical clinic, they're more likely to be exposed to COVID-19 than somebody working in a standard sort of admin office job. Do the workers work with people who would be vulnerable to severe disease if they contract COVID? And I'll discuss who is considered a vulnerable person with respect to COVID-19 shortly. What is the likelihood that COVID-19 could spread in the workplace? So some work tasks may require workers to work in close proximity to each other, for example, in manufacturing settings. Also consider, do workers interact with a large number of people in the course of their work, which may contribute to a super spreading event? This might be a consideration in Victoria at the moment. So there is what they're calling a grace period with respect to retail, where unvaccinated people can actually attend retail stores up until the state reaches 90% vaccination rates, which means that it is more likely that a retail worker will come into contact with somebody who is contagious. Any other control measures that are available and in place in your workplace, and whether those control measures are sufficient to minimise the risks of COVID as far as is reasonably practicable. And finally, would a requirement to be vaccinated be unlawful in the circumstances? For example, would it discriminate against a class of employees? So we need to consider, if we're going to mandate vaccination as a business policy, as opposed to under a public health order, what carve-outs do we need to have? What exemption criteria should we consider? So after considering all of these factors, the answers to those questions and consideration of those factors may lead to employers coming to the reasonable conclusion that their obligations under the work health and safety legislation requires them to mandate vaccinations across its workforce. But also consider that in a scenario where an employee could continue to work from home, then it would be unlikely that requiring vaccination as a condition of their employment or attendance at the office would be reasonable and lawful. So just to touch on your health and safety obligations with respect to vulnerable people. So as I said, to meet workplace health and safety obligations, employers should be undertaking risk assessments on a general or broader basis to determine what control measures are necessary to prevent COVID-19 in the workplace. However, the test of what is reasonably practicable actually shifts when we consider vulnerable people, and a more general risk assessment applying to the whole business will not be enough to discharge the workplace health and safety obligations. So Safe Work at present defines a vulnerable person with respect to COVID-19 as being an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person over 50 years with one or more chronic medical conditions, people aged 65 years and older with one or more chronic medical conditions, people over the age of 70, and people with compromised immune systems. Now, at present, pregnancy is not considered to render somebody a vulnerable person, and vaccination is recommended for pregnant people. So this will not render someone a vulnerable person under or with respect to COVID-19. So what Safe Work Australia and the AHPPC recommend with respect to vulnerable people is taking an individualised risk assessment for those people. So we need to assess and mitigate risk with consideration of the characteristics of the worker, the workplace, and the work. So we may consider redeploying the individual into a non-customer or client-facing role if possible, allowing them to continue to work from home, and increasing things like personal protective equipment in the workplace. So where risk can't be appropriately mitigated, employers and employees should consider alternate arrangements to accommodate a workplace absence. So the person may take a period of leave until the circumstances change such that it is safe for them to attend work. So what are these control measures that we're talking about with respect to workplace health and safety? They will differ depending on the business. So what's reasonable in a medical facility is not going to be the same for an office where 50% of staff can continue or will continue to work from home. So given the high level of contagion of COVID-19, and in particular the Delta variant, Safe Work Australia and the AHPPC recommend that vaccination is a significant control measure in managing the risk of COVID-19 in the workplace. And they also recommend testing for COVID-19 in certain circumstances as well. Other control measures include the use of PPE, hand sanitizing, social distancing, work bubbles whereby staff are grouped and don't cross over with others. So you might have, group A who come into the office on a Monday, group 2 who come in on a Wednesday, and group 3 who come in on a Friday. We also need to consider things like density limits and temperature checking. It is important to ensure that control measures are reviewed on a regular basis in light of changing circumstances. So as Victoria reopens and people go back into offices and go back into the workplace, you need to have regard to things like case numbers, whether employees need to catch public transport or whether the business might provide transport to them or pay for parking and things like that so that they don't need to be sitting on a train for an hour to get to work. Another control measure recommended by Safe Work in line with mandatory vaccination within workplaces is vaccination policies, even if there is no public health order in place. So if you've come to the decision that you need to implement a mandatory vaccination policy, there's two ways that this can be done. It's either legally required under a public health order where it is lawful and reasonable having regard to all of those factors that we just discussed. So this is a two-stage test. Is the mandatory vaccination policy lawful, and is the direction reasonable? In determining if it's lawful, we need to consider a variety of workplace laws. So as we've discussed, the work health and safety obligations, and also federal and state-based discrimination laws. So for example, under discrimination laws, a person with a medical condition preventing compliance with the direction may argue that they've been indirectly discriminated against. So this is where you have a blanket requirement for all staff, but some people are actually worse off under that requirement. And as a result, if the business mandated vaccination, it would need to accommodate for some exemption criteria. Now, with respect to COVID-19, generally speaking, only genuine medical exemptions will be accepted as a criteria to avoid vaccination. I was having a look to see if there are any other criteria, such as religion, as we discussed, pregnancy, any of those kind of factors. I haven't found any cases to date which allow for vaccination exemptions on other grounds. It's likely, though, that we will see some other things come into our court system and our legal system in the coming months. That being said, general anti-vaccination views are not protected under any workplace laws or discrimination laws, and therefore are not a valid reason for exemption. So moving on to whether a direction is reasonable. So we need to consider a variety of factors. So is there a public health order or a recommendation that workers in your industry be vaccinated? Are your staff exposed to risk? Do your staff work with vulnerable people? What is the likelihood of the virus spreading in your workplace? Do your staff interact with large numbers of other people in the course of their work, like suppliers and customers? And any other control measures that are in place. So really looking at, well, what are the recommendations and factors outlined by Safe Work Australia here and applying them to your business. So in terms of undertaking this risk assessment, the Fair Work Ombudsman has very helpfully published additional guidance in the form of these 4 tiers of work to assist in assessing what is lawful and reasonable in the context of mandatory vaccination. So where employees are required as part of their duties to interact with people who are at increased risk of being infected with COVID, they'll fall into tier 1. In tier 2, we have employees who are required to have close contact with people who are vulnerable to the health impacts of coronavirus. So those working in healthcare or aged care. And that's why we're really seeing every state introducing mandatory vaccination requirements in residential aged care settings. And this is because there is also a really increased likelihood of it spreading very quickly in those settings as well. In tier 3, We have people or workers where there is an interaction or likely interaction between employees and other people, like customers, other employees, or the general public in the normal course of employment. So stores providing essential goods and services. And finally, in Tier 4, we have where employees have minimal face-to-face interaction as part of their normal employment duties, for example, where they're working from home. You do also need to consider, though, that you're likely to have a mix of different employees performing work in different tiers, all of which could change at any time. So, for example, you might have an administrative staff member who works away from customers or works remotely. They're likely to fall into a different tier to other staff who are customer facing and might be going out to sales meetings or meeting with clients to discuss your services. This raises a policy question as to whether businesses should consider different rules or directions based on the type of work performed by the employee. And we also need to consider the impact of different locations. If you have employees in different states, then you need to consider the circumstances in that state at the particular time. It's more likely at the moment that a mandatory vaccination policy would be lawful and reasonable in Victoria and New South Wales, as opposed to, for example, South Australia, where, again, there is very little community transmission, if any. That, however, could change, as I note that in South Australia, they have announced some changes to their border rules in which they'll be letting other states enter again. So that could change in the coming months as well, and that is another consideration. So the next step in implementing a vaccination policy is consultation. So under the Work Health and Safety Act, you have an obligation to consult with employees regarding WHS matters, and this naturally will extend to COVID-19 and therefore vaccination. So in terms of consultation, we recommend issuing correspondence outlining that the business has a preliminary view to implement a mandatory vaccination policy and inviting feedback. It is a requirement under the Act that people be given a reasonable opportunity to express their views with respect to these issues and contribute to the decision-making process related to the matter. You also need to consider the feedback after allowing a period of time for that feedback to be provided. And that relates to the obligation to consider and take into account the views of the workers. And you then need to consult and advise on the outcome of that feedback and consultation process. So if you've decided, yes, we're going to proceed with implementing a mandatory vaccination policy, then you need to implement that policy and you need to notify workers. Failure to consult with workers is a breach of the Work Health and Safety Act, and penalties of up to $20,000 for an individual and $100,000 in the case of a body corporate may apply. So it's really important that you don't skip this step. So this is just a handy little process flow that we have put together to assist businesses in making this decision. So step one, consider, is it lawful or is it required under a public health order? If yes, workers have to reply. It's simple. You don't really need to do anything further here. If it's no, then you need to consider, okay, are we going to mandate it? The next step there is undertaking a risk assessment. So is it lawful and reasonable? If yes, then you can proceed. If not, then you wouldn't be able to implement the policy. We then go through our consultation process and then our implementation if you decide to proceed. So that implementation involves notifying employees of the decision, informing them of what the requirements are, ensuring that you have appropriate mechanisms to collect evidence of vaccination status if you're going to do so under the policy. And you also need to consider that the policy should allow sufficient time for employees to attain the required vaccination status. So, for example, you wouldn't really reasonably be able to implement a mandatory vaccination policy in circumstances where you're saying, okay, you need to be fully vaccinated by Monday. That doesn't allow people enough time to actually obtain a vaccine. And whilst we have better availability of vaccinations at the moment, there are still other factors that may impede on a person's ability to be vaccinated at that time. And people do still have the right to, do some research for themselves and determine what vaccination is right for them as well. And they may need to, make an appointment with their GP to discuss those concerns as well. And then just touching on privacy concerns before going into some people management considerations for you. This is something that comes up a lot. So businesses that have mandated vaccination may ask the employee to provide evidence of the vaccination. This evidence is health information and is therefore sensitive information under the Privacy Act. So employers can only request and collect sensitive information where the individual consents to its collection and the information is reasonably necessary for or directly related to one or more of the employer's functions or activities as outlined in Principle 3 of the Australian Privacy Principles. A business's functions or activities can include preventing or managing COVID-19 spread, but also consider that the collection may be mandatory under a public health order as well. So we don't recommend that you collect employee vaccination status on a just in case basis. It's less likely to be considered reasonably necessary and therefore not permitted to be asked under the rules of the Privacy Act. Now, something that has come up recently that businesses need to consider is collection of vaccination certificates. There are a couple of different versions which are floating around. There's one which is sort of just the green tick certificate, which just ticks off that the person has been fully vaccinated. There is another more detailed certificate, which I believe shows the different dates that the vaccination was received on, but it also contains a particular number called the Individual Health Identifier number. Now, this particular number actually creates additional and more onerous obligations under a different piece of privacy legislation called the Health Identifiers Act. So we recommend that businesses ensure that if they're requesting any vaccination evidence be provided, that they ensure that that number is redacted or is not provided. And this is because most businesses will not be aware of what the obligations are under the Health Identifiers Act. This piece of legislation is extremely specific as to what the requirements are. So realistically and practically, it's easier to simply not collect this information. So moving on to our people management issues to consider. So the first one that I'm sure many people have experienced already is vaccine hesitancy and or refusal. So if a vaccination is required under a public health order or reasonable workplace policy, an employee must comply. It is not an optional requirement. Particularly under a public health order, it is law, and both you as the business owner and the employee are required to comply with that. So if an employee is refusing to be vaccinated or is saying, oh, I'd rather wait until, for example, Novavax is available in January, they'll generally be unable to attend the workplace under a policy or public health order. And as I said, will be placed on a period of unpaid leave. You might consider redeploying them into alternative duties, however. Businesses may be able to take disciplinary action, which could result in the termination of employment. But before you do so, you should really be taking steps to understand the reasons for the employee's refusal, and where appropriate, taking the time to encourage them to comply with the direction and provide them with additional opportunities to comply. If you have a number of people within your workforce who are hesitant or don't want to be vaccinated, you might consider running an information session. So I've heard of a lot of businesses, bringing in their local GP to run a session on providing vaccine information. And that actually enables the people to not feel like it's their obligation and it's a waste of their time to, have to make an appointment and go and get this information, but it provides them with the ability to ask questions and get some clarification. And it also will help you meet your consultation obligations under the workplace health and safety legislation too. So we also need to consider that any disciplinary action will depend on the specific facts and circumstances, and the business will need to consider any other rights and obligations arising out of an enterprise agreement or other agreement, modern award, workplace policy, or state or territory public health order. So this is including as well considering any exemption criteria, and also, if you have a grievance policy or procedure, what that outlines, or a dispute resolution policy or procedure, what it outlines you must do in those circumstances. The other people management issue is refusal to come into the workplace or the office. So the first step in trying to avoid this is consultation. If you want people to come back to the office, don't just direct them to do so. people who've been working from home for a considerable period of time might really enjoy that because they feel like they've got a better work-life balance working from home, or they might have genuine concerns about COVID-19, or they might have developed a health concern during this period of time as well. So discuss with them, see what their thoughts are, see what works for them, and work with them if they do have any concerns. And so you really should be seeking to understand the reasons for their refusal before taking any action, and have a plan in place. So, having a look at, okay, well, when are we allowed to go back into the office if there's a public health order in place? If there then is one, then what does it say? When can we go back and how can we go back? What are the rules? What are the density requirements? And notify your workers of those. If there's nothing but you can go back to the office, then consider having a bit of a staged return to the office as well, and easing people into it if you can. And that kind of hinges on the fact that your direction to attend the office must be reasonable and lawful. So as I said earlier, in Victoria, the direction remains that an employer can only permit a worker to perform work at the work premises if it is not reasonably practicable for the worker to work from home, essentially. And this applies up until the 18th of November, and it may be extended. That being said, employees do have an obligation to comply with lawful and reasonable directions of their employers. And if they fail to comply, then they may be subject to disciplinary action up to and including termination of their employment. It is important, no matter how frustrated you are, though, to not rush any disciplinary process. So it still needs to be procedurally fair. You still should be giving them notice of your intent to discuss the concerns and outline what those concerns are. Allow them the opportunity to bring a support person to that meeting, whether it's virtually or in person. Allow them to provide their responses, consider those responses, and issue warnings before you get to the point of termination. If you are an existing HR Assured client, you can of course call the telephone advisory service and seek some advice on those circumstances as well. And the final people management issue to discuss is managing remote or hybrid workplaces. So there are many challenges of managing a remote workforce, and these include factors from an employee perspective. So there is a lack of face-to-face supervision. So whilst managers are worrying whether employees are working enough, are they bludging? Are they really not doing anything and just moving their mouse around every 10 minutes to make it look like they're doing something? Employees may actually struggle with having reduced access to managerial support and communication. It's not as easy as going and knocking on your manager's door or going to your colleague's desk. You have to make a phone call or send an email, and you feel like you're bothering people when you're working from home more. We also have to consider the lack of access to information, and this kind of touches base on that last point as well. So getting answers to what seems like simple questions can feel like a large obstacle to a worker based at home, but that also applies to managers as well. Again, you can't just walk up to your colleague or your employee and ask where they're up to with that project. You've got to try and call them. Perhaps they're, in the kitchen making a coffee, they miss your call, they try and call you back, you've gone to the bathroom and you play phone tag all day. We also need to consider things like social isolation. People might be struggling with working from home and not seeing their family and friends if they're in a lockdown, and that might also affect their work performance as well. And we also have to consider distractions at home. I, for one, certainly get distracted by my dog sometimes. He's very, very cute. And then I realize it's been 10 minutes that I've been rubbing his belly and I should get back to work. So managing people from different locations is difficult. But like I said with the last slide, it is important to remember that just because someone is working from home, they shouldn't be treated any differently. So if you wouldn't discipline somebody via text or email from the office, don't do it when managing them remotely. Essentially, it is the same process to follow. You might just need to do it virtually. It's really important to kind of establish that rapport when you've got people working in different locations and working from home. We really struggle as people with not seeing people visually. When you're having a discussion with an employee in person, it's much easier to read cues, read their facial expression, and kind of understand and get a picture of how they're feeling. And that's really obvious when working from home. People don't notice it. I've definitely seen with my colleagues. I don't know if they're having a busy day or not feeling the best because I'm not visually seeing them, as opposed to when we're in the office and I can, hear it in their voice that they're a bit stressed out. So it's really important to really engage with your employees in as close to the same way as you can when you are in the office. And if that is by having video calls and things like that, then that's the best way to do that. So some tips for managing a remote or hybrid workplace successfully. So you should establish structured check-ins. So it doesn't have to be every day. That can be a little bit much for people, but regularly enough to stay in touch and on top of what your team is doing. So this is also better than just randomly calling them to check in and see what they're doing and where they're up to. Of course, that's fine if you need to follow up on a piece of work, but if an employee gets, multiple calls a week from their boss when they're working from home, it's more likely they're going to feel like they're being micromanaged and you don't trust them. You should also consider rostering. So if you are allowed to attend the office, consider things like having certain people attending the office on certain days, subject to any public health orders and your risk assessment. So like I said, you might do a bubbling kind of arrangement where you've got 5 people who go in on a Monday, 5 on a Wednesday, 5 on a Friday, and something like that. That is going to ensure, depending on the circumstances, that the risk of COVID spreading between the whole office is less. But also allows people to reconnect with each other. You should also have different communication technology options. So email really isn't sufficient, and I'm sure everybody has been using Zoom quite a bit in the last 2 years. So remote workers really will benefit from having a richer technology like video conferencing. And like I said, this gives you the visual cues that people would have if they were face-to-face, though depending on their internet connection. Video conferencing does have a lot of advantages, especially for smaller groups. It allows for increased mutual knowledge about co-workers and helps to reduce the sense of isolation among teams. This is also really important if you've had new staff come into your business. We've certainly at HR Assured had quite a few new people come in and start working from home, which is really different to our normal arrangement. So it's important to see people's faces and introduce one another. Video is also really useful for complex or sensitive conversations, as it's more personal than written or audio only communication. You might also consider implementing a working from home or hybrid work policy, which outlines your expectations. So this way, if there's any unacceptable deviation, you have something to rely on in a disciplinary process. So most businesses are okay with employees going and popping a load of washing on when they're working from home and, when it's done, pegging it out. But if it's excessive, then it needs to be addressed. Another thing to assist in managing a remote or hybrid workplace is consider whether your business has or should implement an employee assistance program provider. So this is essentially a counselling services that employees have free access to. The last 2 years have been incredibly stressful for a lot of people, and some may need some additional support. And without that support, it may actually impact on their work performance. The other thing, and I've said this on all of the slides, is don't forget your procedural fairness. Any disciplinary process, performance management, and termination process must be fair. So moving on to your questions, I can see a couple might have come up in the chat. So I'll just have a quick look. It doesn't look like any have come in actually. So if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to send them through. I know I've spoken a lot and it's probably a lot of information to digest at the moment. So I'll give everyone a minute or two to sort of type in the Q&A box if they do have any questions. So I've got one that is from Kelly. Are people who are not educators but work around children in education facilities on occasion required to vaccinate as per the PHO? I would need to have a look at the specific PHO and I don't have it in front of me at the moment. It will depend on the state. So for example, I was looking at the Northern Territory directions this morning and they're a little bit more broad. So it doesn't specifically require that you're working in a school or an education setting. to be vaccinated, but others are more specific. So I would need to have a look at it. Sorry, Kelly. So Pam, I can see, has asked, are we able to get a copy of the presentation? So the webinar has been recorded and will be distributed. You'll get a link later today sent to your email address. I can see another one, a question on Metro Melbourne office workers who's not currently an authorised worker. Is the 18th of November the eligible return date? So at present, yes, it is. If you're not an authorised worker, that is the date that the workplace directions are in force until, but I believe that coincides with the existing end date of the state of emergency. So if that is extended, we might see an additional direction in respect to return to the workplace issued. So it's a bit of a wait and see, but at present, yes. Awesome. So I will also just add, we will send out to you via email a COVID safe employment application form as well, which we have developed. It is available on the HRA cloud, but this is another question that has come up through the telephone advisory service quite regularly. Is, can I ask a prospective employee whether they are vaccinated? And absolutely you can if you have a vaccination policy or it's required under a public health order. So we have devised an application form which asks this question, and to ensure that it's not discriminatory, it does ask for the person to provide additional information in respect of that. We also recommend, if you have a mandatory vaccination policy, that you update your employment contracts to include vaccination as being a condition of employment. So if they are not vaccinated, their employment cannot continue. And this will then also apply where there is a requirement for people to have booster vaccinations as well. So I can't see any other questions that have come through, but of course, please feel free to keep sending them through or send an email across. So obviously this presentation has been attended by some of our existing clients and also some prospective clients. So if you are not a client of HR Assured yet, you can get a complimentary workplace consultation with us, and a HR Assured team member will be in touch with you after the webinar if you would like to do so. So there are no obligations with respect to this. It's just 30 minutes of expert advice to help your business. So to arrange that complimentary consultation, please look out for our email after the webinar. And of course, if you're an existing HR Assured client, you have access to our 24/7 telephone advisory service. So please call us if you do have any questions. But thank you so much for attending our webinar today. I hope it was informative and I look forward to seeing you at any other webinars that we run.